In 1974, inside a cramped Memphis radio studio, the world's most famous singer sat in front of a microphone and realized this was not going to be a friendly chat. The room was small enough that every breath sounded loud in the headphones. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. The red on air light glowed above the glass like a warning sign. On the other side of the desk, the interviewer wore a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had a reputation in town. He was the man who asked the questions other hosts were too scared to touch. For the first few minutes, it sounded harmless enough. A joke about the old days in Tupelo, a comment about girls screaming on Sullivan, a little tease about the white jumpsuits and high collars. The audience listening in their cars probably laughed. The host laughed. Elvis gave a soft chuckle too, the kind he had used for years when he wanted to smooth the edges of a moment. The chuckle faded, the questions did not. One line slipped in with a light tone, but it hit like a slap. The host asked if Elvis ever felt like a bloated imitation of himself, staggering around in rhinestones, a parody of the man he used to be. The words were dressed as humor. The message was not overweight, washed up, a joke in his own costume. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Listeners only heard silence. In the studio, people felt something else. Technicians looked down at the boards. A producer swallowed hard. Even the host seemed to feel the air change. Elvis leaned in. The chair creaked under his weight. His face was calm, but a different kind of light flickered in his eyes now. Not the stage light, not the television glare. This was something older and sharper. "Would you mind saying that again?" 7 words, soft, polite, and heavy enough to tilt the whole room. The host's smile faltered. He had pushed hard against Elvis Presley for his live audience. He was ready for nervous laughter, for an easy punchline, for a man who would shrug and accept the insult. He was not ready for the question to come back at him. That second, in that small studio, a choice appeared. This could stay another cheap moment on the radio, or it could become something else entirely. For once, Elvis was not the one under the microscope. The interviewer was. This story is not about a single rude question. It is about the years of jokes that came before it, the pain that sat in that chair with Elvis, and the night he decided he would not let anyone laugh over his broken places without hearing what that laugh cost. The microphone was still live. The nation was listening. The king was tired. He was not finished. To understand that one line in that small Memphis studio, you have to see where Elvis Presley was standing in his own life when he walked through the station doors that night. Almost 2 decades had passed since he walked into Sun and changed the sound of American radio forever. The lean boy with the twitching leg and the wild hair was gone. In his place stood a man in his late 30s, worn down by endless tour, bad sleep, and a body that no longer did what his mind demanded. The world still called him the king, but the crown felt heavier with every year. The Vegas years had brought money, crowds, and a new kind of cage. Night after night, the same stages, the same songs, the same spotlight, hotel suites that never felt like home, pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to walk out in front of thousands and pretend that applause could drown out exhaustion. Newspapers did not talk about the strain. Headlines joked about his jumpsuits and his waistline. Critics who once feared his name now treated him like a cartoon. In that climate, publicity mattered. Every article, every photograph, every interview had the power to shape the story people told about him. Colonel Parker saw that clearly. Fans needed to be reminded that Elvis was still sharp, still funny, still present. A radio interview on a strong local station in Memphis sounded like an easy way to do that. Home turf, home accent, safe ground. The station loved the idea. Their host, a man known all over the region, had built his career on pushing celebrities past rehearsed answers. He called it honesty. Guests called it rough once the microphones were off. He did not want to chat with Elvis Presley. He wanted to test him. Before the show, the hallway outside the studio buzzed with quiet energy. Staff members stole quick glances as Elvis walked past in a dark suit, sunglasses hiding tired eyes that had seen too many hotel ceilings. He shook hands. He thanked people by name when he could. A paper cup of coffee cooled in his hand. The host stepped forward, all charm and teeth. Real honor, Elvis, he said. Seriously, been wanting to do this for years. The words sounded respectful. Something in the tone pricked. Elvis had heard that tone before, from comedians who made fun of his weight, from reporters who said, "Sir," while sharpening their pens. He smiled anyway. Pride and habit would not let him be rude. That did not mean he could not feel the edge. Inside the studio, the space felt even smaller. Wires coiled around the floor. A stale smell of smoke and old coffee clung to the walls. Headphones waited on the desk like a set of cuffs. The red ON air light rested dark for now, a quiet warning of what would happen when everything he said became permanent. As Elvis sat down, the chair pressed into his back. Pain flared where the last show had left its mark. Doctors gave him pills because his nerves burned and his spine ached from years of swinging guitars and carrying stages on his shoulders. No one wrote headlines about that. Jokes about his weight sold better. The host eased into his seat, slid his own headphones on, and leaned in close enough that Elvis could smell the mint gum behind the cologne. That charm returned. "This will be easy," he said. "Just a conversation. People want to hear from you, that is all." Elvis nodded. He had been doing interviews long enough to know that just a conversation could mean almost anything. At that point in his life, he had trained himself to keep answers short and honest without feeding the beasts circling outside Graceland's gates. The truth was already heavy enough. There was no need to decorate it for strangers. Then the red light flicked on. The studio changed in a heartbeat. Private time was over. The first questions came like warm-up stretches. Childhood in Tupelo, the first guitar, his mother and how much her belief meant to him. Those were safe roads. He spoke about them the way he always did, voice gentle, jokes scattered like small lights along a dark path. Listeners could picture the poor boy in hand-me-down clothes, singing to cracked walls and dreaming of something more. It was a story he had told before, but it remained true. Talk moved to the first big records. That's All Right, the early tour, the way girls screamed until their throats were raw. The host laughed that loud, eager laugh again and prodded for little stories, tiny mistakes, funny memories. Elvis gave him some, a missed cue, a broken guitar string, moments where the past still felt alive and warm. Under the surface, another current ran. The host pressed harder every few minutes, just enough to see if Elvis would flinch. A comment about younger artists on the charts, a line about how the world had changed, a hint that maybe rock had moved on and left its first king behind. Each time, the words wore a cloak of curiosity. "Do you ever feel like the world passed you by, Elvis?" He answered with care. He said he was grateful to still be singing. He said music belonged to everyone and every generation brought its own sound. He said there were nights when he watched some of the new acts and felt proud of what came after him. He added a light joke about being an old man in Vegas so the host would not feel the strain. Questions drifted toward the white suits and huge belts. The host spoke about them like costumes at a circus. "Who came up with those wild outfits?" he asked. "Ever wake up and think, man, I have become my own impersonator?" The word hung there, impersonator. It sounded like a throwaway laugh line. Elvis had watched hundreds of men put on wigs and fake sideburns to play him in small lounges and cheap bars. That part did not bother him. Those men were working. They were chasing their own dream. The part that strung was the suggestion that the original had become the copy. He let out a soft laugh and said the suits were just clothes, nothing more. He said the music mattered, not the fabric. He reminded the host that he had grown up poor. For a boy who once had nothing, shining on stage still felt like a blessing. Inside, another voice whispered. That voice remembered television sketches where actors wobbled on stage in fat suits pretending to be him. It remembered cruel drawings in magazines, his face puffed up and eyes dimmed, with captions that called him a has-been. That private voice wondered how many people listening were tuning in to hear a hero and how many were waiting to hear evidence that their joke was true. The host sensed that he had brushed a sore spot. Instead of backing away, he circled. He spoke about cancelled concerts. He mentioned whispered reports of slurred lyrics. He said some fans felt disappointed when shows ended early. Every point carried a seed of truth. Every question was aimed at the weakest parts of a tired man's life. Elvis answered as honestly as he could without spilling his entire medical chart into a microphone. He said he struggled with pain. He said he was human. He said he hated letting people down more than they would ever know. He did not spell out the aching nights, the days when his hands shook, the doctors who handed him little pills and called them solutions. Somewhere along the way, the host made a promise to the audience. "We are just getting started," he said. "After the break, we are going to talk about the tough stuff, the things people really want to know about Elvis Presley in 1974. The words sounded playful on the surface. Deep down, every person in that studio understood what they meant. The soft questions were almost over. The host planned to walk straight into the rumors and the mockery, then throw in a laugh at the end so he could claim it was all in good fun. Elvis smiled for the microphone. Years of training made sure his voice stayed, even as he agreed and thanked the station. His hands told another story. Fingers drummed against his leg with a little more force. Shoulders felt tighter under the fabric of his jacket. As the commercials rolled, the red light went dark. Private sound returned to the room. Paper rustled. Chairs scraped. The host took off his headphones and glanced across the desk, weighing how far he could go without losing the audience. Elvis stared down at the microphone. Somewhere between the coffee, the pain in his back, the weight of headlines, and the forced jokes about his own body, a question grew inside him too. How much more of this could he sit through without saying what it really felt like? The second half of the interview would give him an answer. When the show came back from the break, the sound felt a little sharper through the headphones. Advertisements faded. The red on-air light burned again above the glass. The host's voice rolled out smooth and confident, as if the last few minutes had only been a warm-up. He welcomed listeners back, reminded them that they were hearing Elvis Presley live in Memphis, and promised that the second half of the conversation would be where they asked what everyone at home really wonders. That phrase sat on the table like a loaded gun. The host leaned in toward the microphone. He carried that practiced tone that pretended to be casual while every word was chosen. He said it was an honor. He said he grew up on Elvis records. Then he slid the knife in with a smile. "Let me ask you something a lot of people say these days," he began. "You were the king. Now there are other names on the charts. Do you still feel like that man from the 50s, or is that a crown you just wear out of habit at this point?" There was no insult in the surface of the sentence. The cut lived underneath. The implication that the title had become a costume, that the man who held it now did not deserve it anymore. Years of interviews had taught Elvis how to survive these moments. He took a breath that the audience could not hear and gave the kind of answer that showed respect without feeding the flames. He said the crown never belonged to him alone. The fans gave it. The fans could take it away. He said he was grateful that anybody still cared enough to come to a show. He said music always moved on, that new boys came, that he had been one of those new boys once, and that he was proud to see other artists doing what they loved. The words sounded humble. The corners of his mouth tightened around them. The host heard that slight tension and decided he had found the vein. He did not want a gentle legend. He wanted a story people would repeat the next day at coffee. So he went further, always keeping just enough politeness to shield himself if anyone called him on it. "Some folks say you are stuck doing the same old songs," he continued. "They say people only come to hear the hits from 20 years ago, not the new stuff. Does that ever bother you? Does it ever feel like you are trapped playing a version of Elvis Presley that belongs to 1956, not 1974? Elvis shifted in his chair. Pain flickered up his spine. The same shows that critics mocked as tired repeated the same physical strain night after night. He answered with a soft laugh that did not quite hide the fatigue. He said fans had favorite songs. People married to those songs. People buried loved ones to those songs. A man who complains about singing, "Are you lonesome tonight?" too many times, he said, has forgotten what a gift it is to be asked to sing at all. New material mattered to him, but if a woman in the third row waited her whole life to hear "Love Me Tender" from his mouth, he was going to sing it. A little silence followed. The host looked at him through the glass of the control booth and saw an opening anyway. He had a list of topics scribbled on a sheet beside him. Among the underlined words were health, pills, and cancelled shows. The first half of the interview had softened the audience and brought them in with nostalgia. Now he wanted the truth. "So let us talk about the hard part," he said. "You have had to cancel some dates. Stories get around. People talk about you not feeling well, about you leaning on medication. That is not my business, but it is something people out there are curious about. How bad has it gotten? Are you taking things just to walk out on stage now?" The question carried the tone of concern. The shape of it resembled a caring friend checking in. The intention felt different. This was not a private doctor asking how a patient was sleeping. It was a man with thousands of listeners pressing the gas pedal on rumors. For a moment, Elvis let the stillness stretch. Years of conditioning told him to answer quickly, to defuse, to make light of it. Another part of him ignored that training and sat in the pause. That shorter, slightly rougher breath reached the audience. People in cars and kitchens leaned in. He spoke slowly. He said his body had paid a price for the life he lived. This many shows, this many flights, this much pressure did things to a man's nerves and bones. He said doctors had given him prescriptions for pain. He said that sometimes he woke up and felt like he had been hit by a bus that backed up and did not apologize. Pills helped him stand up on bad days. Prayer helped him stand up on others. The host listened, then tilted his head toward the microphone with a new edge. "So you are saying you take them before you go on stage?" he pressed. "People wonder if they get Elvis or if they get something chemical walking out there in a jumpsuit. Do you ever worry that you are cheating them?" The word cheating rang out. It hit the old wounds. Newspaper stories that circled when a show ended early. Fans who did not know about doctors' warnings or collapsed lungs, only that their ticket money had gone to a night that did not deliver. Comedians who took those stories and turned them into jokes about a pill bottle with sideburns. A short memory reel played behind the quiet in that studio. Late-night hosts waving prescription bottles in the air and doing impressions of his slow drawl. Magazine covers with cruel caricatures, his face swollen and eyes drooping, with captions that asked whether the king had overdosed on his own fame. Preachers on television who once called him an agent of sin, now calling him a pathetic example of wasted talent. All of it rolled up inside the host's question, "Are you cheating them?" Elvis answered in a voice that carried less humor now. He said he never wanted a fan to feel cheated. He said he had sung sick, sung in pain, sung heartbroken, because he knew people drove miles, saved money, and arranged their lives around that one night. He said he was not proud of missed shows. He said he was not proud of the days when he pushed his body past its limits so far that it failed in public. He did not try to excuse that. He only said he was human. The host nodded, as if he had just gently led a man to confess. The small triumph in his eyes betrayed him. Satisfied with the reaction, he changed angle again. "Let me ask you something else," he said. "There are folks who say your audience now is different. They talk like the people in those Vegas rooms come as much out of curiosity as out of love, like they want to see the legend up close, even if it hurts. How does that feel? Do you think they are there because they still adore you, or are they there to see if the myth has fallen apart?" The question scraped against something deep. Imagine a man who once walked on stage and saw pure awe looking back. Imagine that same man hearing people whisper that crowds now came the way they might visit an old tourist attraction, to check on it, to see if it still stood, to take a picture of the cracks. Elvis thought of faces he had seen in those last rows, old fans with tears in their eyes, young ones discovering him for the first time, people who brought their grown children so they could say, "I saw him once." He also remembered the ones who shouted ugly things from the dark when a show did not go as planned, the ones who laughed when reviews called him bloated, the ones who wrote letters not filled with love but with demands. He answered in a tight but steady tone. He said he believed most people still came because the music meant something to them. He said he could feel that weight when he walked on stage and heard the first gasp, even before a note. He said there might be a few who came to see if the newspapers were right, who came in expecting a train wreck, but that his job was to sing for the ones who still believed. Weight lingered on the phrase, still believed. The host listened carefully. He heard the loyalty, he heard the hurt, he heard another chance to turn the screw. A smile crept back into his voice. "Let us be honest here," he said. "You go out in those rhinestone suits with the big collars, the big belts, the whole thing. There are people who say it looks more like self-parody than rock and roll now. Some call you your own impersonator. When you look in the mirror before a show these days, do you feel like Elvis Presley, or do you feel like a man playing a cartoon version of who you used to be?" The questions slid into the room like broken glass. That word returned, parody, coupled now with cartoon. It took every lazy joke, every cruel sketch, every mocking impression that had ever been done in his name and rolled them into a single sentence. The host said it with a half laugh, as if it were just teasing. The poison did not dilute. Sound drained out of the space for a moment. Inside, years piled on top of each other. The young man in black and white who scared parents with a curl of his lip. The soldier who came home and found new faces on his throne. The husband who watched his marriage crack under the weight of travel and fame. The performer who swallowed pills because he believed the world would rather see him on a stage half broken than not see him at all. Behind the glasses, Elvis's eyes cooled. Part of him wanted to shrug and say something clever, brush it off with a quick line that would give the host his laugh and move on. That habit lived in his bones after all the television spots and photo shoots. There was another part that had grown louder with each year. A quieter, older voice that belonged to the boy from Tupelo who had promised himself he would never let anyone spit on his mother's faith in him. That voice spoke now. "You have let them joke long enough. You have smiled while they twisted you into something you never were. You have nodded and taken the insult as if you owed it." Across the desk, the host waited for the playful answer he expected, the one his producers would clip for replay. He saw the pause as a sign that he was finally getting what he wanted, a crack, a moment where the mighty Elvis Presley seemed unsure. Elvis moved his hand away from the headphones and leaned in toward the microphone. His shoulders straightened. His voice, when it came, carried none of the soft fuzz he used for light stories. Every syllable landed clean and clear. "Would you mind saying that again?" he asked. The question did not rise. It did not bark. It came out low and even, like steel held in a steady grip. The host let out a quick laugh, unsure whether he had just been invited to continue the joke or challenged to repeat the wound. That little nervous sound floated across the line to every living room and car in range. It bounced off quiet walls in Graceland and off dashboards in small towns where people who grew up on his music now listened in silence. He tried to play it off. "I just mean you have a colorful look these days," he started, words tumbling. Elvis did not let the sentence escape. "No," he said, "the way you said it the first time, about me being a cartoon of myself. Say it again, please." There it was. Power shifted. The interview that had been a game under one man's control suddenly belonged to someone else. The cruel question had been turned around and held up to the light. Listeners did not hear a fading star begging for approval. They heard a man who had spent years swallowing public humiliation finally draw a line. In that instant, the host realized what he had done. He had pushed hard against Elvis Presley. Now the question had come back. The host stared across the desk as if he had not heard Elvis clearly. Noise from the control room faded in his ears. The sheet of questions in front of him suddenly looked less like a clever plan and more like evidence. For a second, his mouth moved without words. Every person behind the glass knew exactly what had been said. Every person also knew that repeating it would sound very different this time. A strained chuckle slipped out. "I was just joking around," he said. "You know, saying you have a larger-than-life look now, people say things." Elvis did not blink. He did not rush to rescue the man from his own words. Years of politeness had taught him how to smooth moments like this. Years of humiliation had taught him what happened when he always did that. The muscles in his jaw settled. The calm did not look soft. It looked final. I heard you the first time, he replied. What I asked was if you would say it again, the way you put it when you thought it was funny. The air changed. Technicians stopped pretending to adjust dials. A producer held one hand over his mouth. Somewhere in the city, a driver turned the volume up an inch, sensing that something real was happening and that it might be over with one wrong move. The host shifted in his seat. Pride would not let him back down completely. Fear would not let him repeat the line exactly as it had fallen. He tried to balance both and only managed to show how weak the foundation had been all along. I said, some people think the jumpsuits and everything make you look like a cartoon version of yourself, he forced out, like a self-parody. The words landed without the cushion of a laugh this time. In the silence that followed, they did not sound clever. They sounded cheap and cruel. Every listener who had chuckled a few minutes earlier heard the same sentence now and felt something different move in their chest. Elvis let the echo sit. Then he spoke. You know, he said slowly, I have been called a lot of things in my life. Sinner, saint. Saint is not true, and sinner is probably not the whole truth either. People have told me I ruined music. People told me I saved it. I have never minded when someone said I looked foolish in a suit or that they did not like my records. A man is allowed to have an opinion. His fingers tapped once on the desk and stopped. Calling a living, breathing person a parody of himself, he continued, is a different kind of thing. The host opened his mouth, but nothing reasonable came out. The rhythm of the show belonged to Elvis now. Control had shifted without noise or raised voices. It slid from the interviewer's hands the moment the guest refused to play the part written for him. Elvis leaned closer to the microphone. The tone of his voice changed again, losing any trace of performance. What came out next did not sound like a rehearsed defense. It sounded like a man who had reached the end of his patience and discovered that truth weighed less than silence. You look at me, he said, and you see the suit, you see the weight. You read the headlines about cancelled shows and pills. I know all that. I carry all that around. When you throw a word like parody at me, you are not talking about cloth and rhinestones. You are talking about a human being who has to open his eyes in the morning and live inside this skin. The studio felt smaller with every sentence. No one in the room moved. Listeners at home sat motionless on couch edges and chair arms, as if an unexpected prayer had started in the middle of an ordinary conversation. When I was a kid in Tupelo, Elvis went on, I would have given anything just to sit in a room like this and play a song on the radio. I never thought about jumpsuits. I never thought about headlines. I just wanted to sing. Somewhere along the way, that little boy turned into a picture people throw darts at to feel better about themselves. A soft breath followed. I'm not saying I have done everything right, he added. I have messed up. I have hurt people I loved. I have stood on stages I never should have walked onto because my body was telling me to lie down and rest. I have taken things that my doctors said would help me keep going, and I have leaned on those things when I should have leaned on something else. That is all true. The confession did not sound like a court statement. It sounded like words that had been waiting in his chest for a long time, looking for a door. That does not make me a cartoon, he said. That makes me a tired man who has been trying very hard not to disappoint people. The host swallowed. Sweat gathered at his temple. No script he had prepared had room for this kind of honesty. He had expected deflection or anger. He had not prepared for a man who would stand in the middle of his own flaws and refuse to let them be turned into a joke. Elvis did not stop there. You asked if I feel like I am cheating my audience, he continued. Let me tell you something. There are nights I walk out there and my back feels like it has a knife in it. My lungs burn. The lights hurt my eyes. I know people spent money they did not have on a ticket. I know they got a babysitter and dressed up. I know they drove 2 hours on a school night. You think I want to let that person down? Images flooded the listener's mind, whether they wanted them or not. Men loosening their ties as the curtain went up. Women holding programs with shaking hands. Kids craning their necks for their first glimpse of the man their parents had talked about for years. A man in pain stepping into a spotlight anyway. There have been shows where I failed them, he admitted. I am ashamed of that. There have been nights where I should have stayed in bed and I went out anyhow because I did not know how to say no. When I hear that somebody felt robbed, that cuts me deeper than any headline ever could. I can live with people laughing at my clothes. I cannot live with the thought that somebody left feeling I did not care. The words pressed against the host's chest like a weight. Listeners heard something else behind them. Under the shame and exhaustion, there was fierce pride. All the tired jokes about Vegas and jumpsuits had never touched that place. That pride did not come from record sales or gold curtains. It came from a man who still believed he owed those people his best, even when his best did not look like it once did. Elvis shifted his focus more directly now. What you did when you called me a parody, he said, was not ask a hard question. It was not journalism. That was you taking all that struggle and turning it into a punchline so you could sound brave on your own show. The host opened his hands in a helpless gesture that no one at home could see. Words tumbled out. I did not mean it that way, he said. It was just a phrase. People say it. The press says it. Elvis listened, then shook his head slightly. A man can repeat what everyone else says, he replied. Or he can think twice before he adds his voice to that noise. You have a microphone. People trust what comes through it. When you choose to spit on somebody who is already down, that says more about you than it does about him. A low murmur rose in the control booth. No one dared to cut to a commercial. No one dared to clear his throat. This had become bigger than a segment on a local station. Every second felt like something that would be replayed for years. The heart of it arrived next. Elvis took a deeper breath. Let me ask you a question, he said. If I walked in here tonight 50 pounds lighter, if the magazines were all calling me handsome and dangerous again, if the late-night boys were still scared to say my name, would you have asked that same thing, word for word? Would you have called me a cartoon then? Or is it only funny when a man looks like he is hurting? The host froze. No easy answer existed. Any word he chose would reveal the intention that had been hiding behind his mask. The entire audience could feel it. The question did not just apply to the man across from him. It stretched out through the wires to every person who had laughed at a cruel joke about a fallen idol and felt that bitter little thrill. Silence bloomed. In living rooms, people stared at their radios with the same uneasy awareness. Some had made those jokes themselves. Some had repeated lines from comedians without thinking about the person on the other end. Elvis had just picked up a mirror and held it steady for all of them. The host's mouth opened and closed. I was just talking like they talk, he muttered finally. It was not personal. That is the problem, Elvis answered. People say it is not personal and forget there is a person standing on the other side of it. A long breath left him. You know, I have stood in front of crowds where the sound made my bones shake, he added. I have had people cry in front of me and tell me my songs kept them alive when they were ready to give up. I have also sat alone in a room with no music at all and listened to my own head tell me I was finished. Those are the longest nights, when you sit there and you wonder if the world remembers you as a man or just as a joke in a white suit. His voice went softer. I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for me, he said. I chose this life. I made choices that hurt me. What I am saying is that there is a line between asking how a fellow is doing and kicking him when you think he cannot hit back. The host's shoulders sagged. In that moment, bravado drained away. He looked less like a fearless truth-teller and more like what he truly was, a man who had gone too far because a crowd rewarded him every time he did. The difference now was that his target had refused to play along. Listeners heard a small swallow. I should not have put it that way, he finally said. If I caused you hurt, I apologize. That was not fair. Elvis nodded once. Thank you, he replied. I can take a tough question. I have been taking them most of my life. Ask me about the cancellations. Ask me about my health. Ask me why I keep going when I look tired. I will answer as honest as I know how. Just remember there is a mama somewhere who raised that boy you are talking to. Mine is not here anymore, but I still feel her listening when somebody talks about me like I am trash. A knot formed in the throat of more than one listener. The host cleared his own throat and tried to regain some rhythm. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe what people needed to hear tonight is that side of you, the human side, not just the legend." Elvis gave a faint, weary smile that carried through in the softness of his next words. "The legend part is easy for folks to play with," he said. "The human part is harder to look at. That is all right. I just wanted to make sure you saw him before you went home and said you turned the king into a punchline on your little show." A nervous laugh flickered, quickly smothered. The rest of the interview moved on, but the center had shifted for good. Questions after that felt smaller. They touched on music, on future plans, on memories of the early days. Nothing the host asked could match the weight of the exchange that had just taken place. The rhythm never quite settled back into light banter. Something raw had been exposed. Out beyond the studio walls, reactions bloomed in real time. In parked cars outside diners, people sat with hands on steering wheels, staring at the dashboard long after the host tried to return to a lighter tone. In small houses at the edge of town, couples looked at each other with wet eyes and said things like, "I had no idea he felt that way." In apartments miles away, younger listeners who had grown up on second-hand stories, more familiar with the jokes than the man, heard him for the first time as a person arguing for his own dignity. Inside the station, the mood had changed as well. Producers who had grinned when the questions turned sharp now watched the host with a mixture of worry and quiet judgment. They understood that Elvis had done something unusual. He had not stormed out. He had not screamed. He had not insulted anyone back. A few clear sentences had been enough to expose the gap between courage and cruelty. When the red light finally went dark and the last station jingle played, the studio returned to ordinary sound. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped, headphones came off. The host looked across the desk at Elvis without the armor of his on-air voice. "Off the record," he said, "I really am a fan." Elvis studied him for a long heartbeat. "I believe you like the music," he said. "I also believe you got used to the sound of your own mouth cutting people up. Maybe tonight you heard what it sounds like from this side." No anger colored the words. The tired kindness in them cut deeper than rage could have. A hand extended. Elvis took it. The grip was firm but not warm. Courtesy had not left him. Trust had. As he stood, muscles in his back protested. The effort it had taken to sit upright through that storm now showed itself in the heaviness of his movement. He thanked the staff, signed a few quick autographs, and walked toward the door. Behind him, the host sat alone at the desk that had felt like a throne an hour earlier. The questions that had once made him feel powerful now lay scattered and exposed. The echo of that one line followed him around the room. "If I walked in here 50 pounds lighter, would you have asked that?" In the days that followed, the tape of that interview would travel far beyond the station's regular reach. Some papers would twist the story. Some would pretend it never happened. Among the people who truly loved Elvis, however, a new kind of respect took root. They had heard the night the king asked a question back. The question ended far more than one cheap joke. In the days after the interview, the tape moved faster than the station ever expected. Producers made a clean copy for their own archive. Someone quietly ran off another copy on the side. That second reel found its way into the hands of a technician who had friends at another station. By the end of the week, pieces of that conversation had aired on late-night slots in cities where Elvis had not set foot in years. No matter how many times they tried to trim it down, the heart of it stayed the same. There was the question. There was the insult. There was the moment when Elvis asked for those words to be said again, not for drama, but for truth. Listeners who had missed it live heard it fresh and uncut. In small towns, the tape played during midnight shifts when the phones were quiet and the air felt thin. Truck drivers rolled through dark highways with that exchange filling their cabs instead of music. Some gripped the wheel a little tighter when Elvis spoke about pain and pills. Others nodded along when he talked about not wanting to cheat a single person who bought a ticket with hard-earned money. The night felt crowded with ghosts for anyone who had ever pushed themselves too far just to avoid letting someone down. Letters began to arrive at the station. Some came on fancy letterhead from offices and newsrooms. Those tried to stay polite as they questioned the host's choice of words. Others came on folded notebook paper from kitchen tables and factory break rooms. Those were less polished and far more honest. Men who rarely wrote anything more than grocery lists sat down and tried to explain how it felt to hear Elvis say he feared becoming a joke. Women who had defended him for years felt a fresh anger rise when they realized how casually someone with a microphone had thrown that word parody into his face. The station manager read each letter with a tightening jaw. A few praised the hard-hitting style and applauded the host for not treating Elvis like a saint. Many more called what had happened a cheap stunt that only revealed one thing clearly: the king had shown more grace than the man who questioned him. The manager understood something simple. Ratings mattered, but so did reputation. A clip that made listeners turn off their radios in disgust or turn against the station as a bully had its own cost. Meanwhile, Elvis went back to work. Shows did not stop for bruised feelings. Contracts did not pause because a man had been honest on the air. Planes still took off for Vegas and back. Guitars still waited to be tuned. Costumes still hung pressed and ready. He carried that night with him like a stone in his pocket, small enough to forget for a few hours, heavy enough to appear when his hand drifted down between songs. Back in his room, the conversation replayed in his head. Sleep came in fits at the best of times. On those late nights, memory ran the tape without a radio. He saw the host smile before the show. He heard the chuckle when the word cartoon slipped out. He felt again that moment where he could have swallowed the insult and moved on, like he had done 100 times before. Another version of the night existed in his imagination. In that other version, he laughed along, played the clown, gave everyone the soundbite they wanted, and drove home a little more hollow. Relief came when he thought about what really happened instead. For once, the words that had sat heavy in his chest had been allowed to leave. He had said that he was tired. He had said that he was ashamed of letting people down. He had said that he was not a parody, but a human being trying to stand up straight in a world that seemed to enjoy watching him bend. Shame still strung, yet it shared space with a strange peace. A line had been drawn. He had not drawn it with anger. He had drawn it with truth. Fans who heard the tape began to tell the story to other fans. Conversations at kitchen tables changed. For years, people who loved Elvis had defended him from jokes by insisting he was still strong, still untouchable, still the same man from the 50s. After that interview, a different kind of defense appeared. People did not just say he was great. They said he was hurting. They said he had been honest. They said he had stood up for himself without raising his voice. Admiration shifted from the myth on stage to the man behind the microphone. Newspapers reacted in a split way. Certain columnists used the moment as another excuse to write about late Elvis as a tragic figure in a glittering cage. They focused on the mention of pills and cancelled shows, not on the dignity he had insisted on. They framed the exchange as a meltdown, even though the tape clearly held no shouting. Other writers, quieter and less flashy, took a more careful approach. They pointed out that mocking a man's body and his pain had become too easy and too common. Those writers admitted that Elvis had made mistakes, but reminded readers that those mistakes did not erase his humanity. The host's career never fully escaped that night. Professional life moved on. He continued to work. He continued to interview guests, yet something had cracked. Anytime he pushed a guest too hard, someone would call in and mention Elvis. When he leaned toward cruelty, callers reminded him of the line that had been drawn in that small room. He had asked whether the king had turned into a cartoon. The answer that echoed back for years was that the interview had revealed the cartoon was standing on the other side of the desk. Years rolled forward. Elvis's own timeline did not stretch as long as many had hoped. The problems he spoke about that night did not vanish. Health battles continued. The pressure did not ease. Pills that once seemed like tools became chains. Not long after, the world would wake to the news that the man who talked so earnestly into that microphone in Memphis had died at Graceland. Headlines again flooded the globe. The same names who laughed before now wrote sudden tributes. The tape of that interview took on a different weight in that new light. Fans who listened after his death heard more than a famous singer defending his pride. They heard a man warning in his own quiet way that he was carrying more than his body could bear. He had spoken about pain, about exhaustion, about the fear of becoming a joke. He had asked that people remember there was a mother who raised the boy under all that pressure. That knowledge cut deep when people realized how close he was to the end when he said those words. Later documentaries picked up that small Memphis moment. Not every film had the rights to the tape. Not every producer chose to pay attention. The ones who did realized its power. When they wanted to show the human being behind the late-night jokes about jumpsuits and weight, they did not only use famous concert clips or staged interviews. They used his voice from that radio booth. They played the part where he said he could accept criticism, but not dehumanization. They included the question he asked back. If I were not suffering, would you still find this funny? New generations heard the story and felt it in a different way. Young people who knew Elvis more as a poster or a Halloween costume than as a living artist were used to a world where fame came tied to ridicule. Social media encouraged mockery. Viral clips often showed the worst moments of someone's life for entertainment. That interview sounded strangely modern to them. It felt like the moment when a meme talks back. They heard a man saying that the person inside the photograph still feels every word. The legacy of that night touched more than conversations about Elvis. In quiet ways, it changed the way some people spoke about every public figure who fell. Not everyone, of course. Cruelty remained, jokes continued. Some lost no sleep over it. Others could not shake his words. When a new artist began to spiral in public, when comedians ganged up on a fragile celebrity, those who remembered the tape heard that soft drawl in the back of their mind asking the same question of them. Are you laughing because you care, or because you think this person cannot hit back? For his most loyal followers, that interview became almost a second kind of comeback. The first comeback had been about music. That famous television special in black leather had reminded the world that Elvis could still command a stage. The second, smaller one in Memphis was about identity. It showed that beneath the layers of excess, the schedules, the mistakes, there was still a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. He refused to let anyone reduce him to a costume or a caricature in front of his own face. Images of late Elvis changed when viewed through that lens. Photographs from the final years had long been used as proof of decline. Writers pointed at his swollen features and asked empty questions about what went wrong. After hearing the interview, some fans looked at those same images differently. They saw not a joke, but a record of a person who had given more of himself than his body could sustain. They saw those suits he defended, not as jokes, but as armor for a man who still walked out on stage despite everything. There is a strange tenderness in that. People realized that while they had long asked whether Elvis let his fans down, that night proved that he felt the weight of letting them down far more than any critic ever could. He did not excuse himself. He did not blame others. He simply refused to be turned into a lifeless symbol of failure. The voice on that tape carried regret, pride, pain, and love, all tangled together. The station in Memphis eventually archived the original reel with more care. For years, it sat in a box marked with the date and a simple note, Presley interview, no big sign, no neon frame. Time moved on, staff changed, technology evolved. Tapes turned into files. Files turned into clips on screens instead of radios. Yet every so often, someone would pull that audio out again. Each time, it sounded as alive as the day it was recorded. The hurt in his voice did not fade. Neither did the strength. Somewhere, a young fan might hear it for the first time tonight. A link shared in a message, a clip played in a documentary, a short extract posted under grainy photos. They will hear the host ask his sharp question. They will hear the soft, firm reply, "Would you mind saying that again?" They will hear the long pause, then the explanation of why words like parody cut deeper than almost anything else. In that moment, Elvis becomes real to them. No longer only a legend in a textbook or a Halloween costume with painted sideburns. No longer only the brilliant youth shaking on stage or the tragic figure slumped in a final photograph. He becomes something far more powerful and far more unsettling. He becomes a man who lived long enough to hear the world laugh at his pain and who still had the courage, one night in Memphis, to ask the world to look at itself. What that night reveals about his legacy reaches beyond entertainment. It says that greatness and brokenness can share the same heart. It says that even the brightest stars can be treated carelessly when people forget they are human. It says that a single quiet stand for dignity can echo longer than 1,000 loud jokes. It also says that we, as listeners and viewers, hold some responsibility for the way our idols rise and fall. Every time that tape plays, a choice returns. The audience can stay on the side of the host who thought cruelty was courage. The audience can move instead toward the man who admitted his flaws and still refused to become a cartoon for their amusement. That choice is part of Elvis Presley's legacy now. He did not just leave behind records and films. He left behind a question that walks with anyone who would rather point and laugh than sit long enough to understand. The king did not live to see all the ways that question would travel. If he had known, perhaps the weight of those final years might have felt a little lighter. Perhaps not. The truth is that his story ended at Graceland, where his life began. What he left behind in that Memphis studio did not end with him. It keeps moving across wires and waves and screens, touching strangers who were not even born when he spoke. Whenever someone hears that soft southern voice asking a hard thing of a man who thought he held all the power, the moment comes alive again. The interviewer pushed hard that night. Elvis pushed back once. The question ended, but the echo never has. There is a reason that a simple radio moment still pulls at people decades later. A superstar let the world see the person behind the image and asked, gently but firmly, to be treated as a man rather than a myth or a punchline. If that moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us how you see Elvis now. Like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and stay close for the next chapter of his life.